Sarah's battered pickup truck wheezed to a stop beside the dusty road, steam pouring from under the hood like smoke signals announcing her latest disaster. She sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, watching the endless stretch of Texas highway shimmer in the afternoon heat. 3 months ago, she'd been living in a downtown apartment with her ex-husband, managing a small bookstore and planning their future together. Now she was alone, broke and stranded somewhere between nowhere and nothing. The divorce papers in her glove compartment were still crisp, unlike everything else in her life that seemed worn thin. Marcus had kept the house, the savings account, and somehow even managed to turn their mutual friends against her. All she'd walked away with was this dying truck, 2 suitcases of clothes, and a stubborn determination to prove she could make it on her own. She grabbed her water bottle and stepped out into the blazing sun. The nearest town was probably 20 miles back, and she hadn't seen another car for the past hour. Her phone showed no signal, just like it had for the last 50 miles of this god-forsaken stretch of highway. Sarah kicked at a loose stone and watched it skitter into the tall grass beside the road. That's when she noticed the fence line running parallel to the highway, and beyond it a large ranch house sitting like a mirage in the distance. Cattle dotted the pastures, and she could make out several outbuildings scattered around the property. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was the only option she had. The walk to the ranch house took nearly 30 minutes. Her city shoes never meant for this kind of terrain. By the time she reached the front porch, her blouse was soaked with sweat, and her throat felt like sandpaper. She knocked on the heavy wooden door, hoping someone was home and praying they weren't the type of country folks who met strangers with a shotgun. The man who answered the door was nothing like what she'd expected. He was tall and lean, with sun-weathered hands and kind eyes the color of faded denim. His brown hair was slightly messed from wearing a hat, and there was something gentle about the way he looked at her. "Despite her disheveled appearance, ma'am, you look like you could use some help," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that wasn't put on for show. Sarah explained about her truck, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. The man, who introduced himself as Jake Mitchell, listened without interruption, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he grabbed his hat from a hook by the door. "Let's go take a look at that truck of yours," he said simply. They rode back to her broken-down vehicle in his dusty pickup, and Sarah found herself stealing glances at this stranger who'd agreed to help, without asking for anything in return. Jake examined her truck with the practiced eye of someone who'd fixed more broken things than he could count. After a few minutes under the hood, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag. "Radiator's shot, and your water pump's on its last legs," he said. "I can get you running again, but it's going to take a few days to get the parts." Sarah's heart sank. She had enough money for maybe 2 nights in a motel, and that was if she could find one that didn't require a credit card she couldn't afford to max out any further. Jake seemed to sense her dilemma. "Tell you what," he said. "I've been needing help around the ranch. My regular hand had to leave sudden-like to take care of his sick mother. If you're willing to work, I can offer you room and board while we wait for those parts." Sarah stared at him, wondering if this was some kind of joke or if country hospitality was really this generous. "I don't know anything about ranch work," she admitted. "Most of it's just common sense and being willing to get your hands dirty," Jake replied. "Can you follow directions and work hard?" She thought about her alternatives, which basically amounted to calling Marcus and begging him to wire her money. The idea made her stomach turn. "Yes," she said firmly. "I can do that." Jake smiled, the first genuine smile she'd received from anyone in months. "Then we've got ourselves a deal." They drove back to the ranch as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Sarah had never noticed from her apartment window in the city. Jake explained that the ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, and he'd been running it mostly alone since his father passed away 2 years ago. The ranch house was simple but comfortable, with wide porches and rooms that felt lived in rather than decorated. Jake showed her to a small guest room with a single bed and a window that looked out over the pastures. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and more welcoming than anywhere she'd stayed since leaving her old life behind. "Supper's in an hour," Jake said from the doorway. "Nothing fancy, just stew and cornbread." After he left, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she'd been driving toward an uncertain future with a rapidly diminishing bank account. Now she was on a working ranch, agreed to do a job she knew nothing about, staying with a man she'd just met. It should have terrified her, but instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. She unpacked her few belongings and changed into jeans and a work shirt, the closest thing she had to ranch attire. When she looked in the small mirror above the dresser, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the carefully styled hair and professional makeup of her old life. In their place was someone who looked tired but determined, someone ready to try something completely different. The smell of cooking food drew her to the kitchen, where Jake was stirring a pot on an old gas stove. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the house, with a large wooden table, shelves lined with well-used cookbooks, and windows that caught the last light of day. "Smells wonderful," Sarah said, and meant it. Jake ladled the stew into bowls and set out thick slices of cornbread still warm from the oven. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, with Jake occasionally pointing out different aspects of the ranch visible through the kitchen windows. The food was simple but satisfying, the kind of meal that fills you up and makes you feel grounded. As darkness settled over the ranch, Sarah found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this unexpected detour might be exactly what she needed. Sarah's first morning on the ranch began before sunrise with the sound of Jake moving around in the kitchen. She'd slept better than she had in weeks, lulled by the complete silence that only comes from being miles away from city noise. When she stumbled into the kitchen still trying to tame her hair, Jake was already dressed and nursing a cup of coffee that looked strong enough to wake the dead. "Morning," he said, offering her a mug. "Hope you're ready to learn the ropes." The coffee was indeed strong, but it cleared the fog from her brain as Jake explained the day's tasks. First, they'd check on the cattle in the north pasture, then repair a section of fence that had been damaged in last week's storm. It sounded simple enough, but Sarah quickly learned that everything on a ranch took twice as long and was 3 times harder than it appeared. Jake saddled 2 horses while Sarah watched nervously. She'd been on a horse exactly once during a childhood birthday party, and that had been a gentle pony that barely moved faster than a walk. The horse Jake led toward her was considerably larger and more intimidating. "This is Buttercup," Jake said with a straight face, introducing her to a massive bay mare who looked like she could step on Sarah without noticing. "She's gentle as a lamb, but she's got enough sense to keep you out of trouble." Getting into the saddle was an adventure in itself. Sarah's first attempt resulted in her hanging awkwardly from the stirrup, while Buttercup stood patiently, probably wondering what this strange human was trying to accomplish. Jake helped her up without making her feel foolish, adjusting the stirrups and showing her how to hold the reins. "Don't overthink it," he advised as they rode out toward the pasture. "Buttercup knows what she's doing even if you don't." The morning was cool and clear, with a light breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and grass. As they rode, Jake pointed out different aspects of ranch management, explaining how he rotated the cattle through different pastures to prevent overgrazing, and how to spot signs of illness or injury in the herd. Sarah found herself fascinated by the complexity of it all. What she'd assumed was simply letting cows wander around eating grass was actually a carefully orchestrated system that required constant attention and decision-making. Jake talked about rainfall patterns, grass quality, and market prices with the fluency of someone who'd spent his entire life learning the intricate relationship between land, animals, and weather. When they reached the cattle, Sarah's city-bred nervousness around the large animals quickly gave way to curiosity. The cows were surprisingly calm, barely lifting their heads as Jake and Sarah rode through the herd. Jake showed her how to count them, check for injuries, and identify the different breeds he raised. "That's a good-looking bunch," he said with satisfaction, watching a group of calves playing in the morning sun. "This year's calf crop is the best I've had in a while." The fence repair that followed was hard, dirty work that left Sarah's hands blistered despite the gloves Jake had given her. They spent hours replacing damaged posts and restringing wire, with Jake patiently teaching her how to use tools she'd never seen before. Every time she felt ready to quit, she reminded herself that she had nowhere else to go and no other options. Jake never made her feel incompetent, even when she struggled with tasks that were second nature to him. He showed her the same technique multiple times without impatience, and when she finally managed to properly tension a section of wire, his quiet good job made her feel prouder than any performance review she'd ever received. By lunchtime, Sarah was exhausted, sweaty, and covered in dirt. Her back ached from unfamiliar work, and she was pretty sure she had a developing sunburn despite the hat Jake had insisted she wear. But there was something deeply satisfying about the physical tiredness, so different from the mental exhaustion that had plagued her during the divorce proceedings. They ate sandwiches sitting on the tailgate of Jake's truck, looking out over the pasture they'd just repaired. Sarah found herself studying Jake's profile as he ate, noting the way he seemed completely at peace in this environment. There was something calming about his presence, a steadiness that she hadn't realized she'd been craving. "You did good today," Jake said, breaking into her thoughts. "Better than most folks manage their first time out." "I feel like I've been hit by a truck," Sarah admitted, "but it's a good kind of tired." Jake nodded, understanding. "Ranch work gets in your blood after a while. There's something honest about it that's hard to find other places." The afternoon brought new challenges as Jake taught her how to check and maintain the ranch's water systems. They drove from windmill to stock tank, with Jake explaining how the solar pumps worked and how to identify problems before they became emergencies. Sarah was amazed by how much infrastructure was required to keep a ranch running smoothly. At one of the water tanks, they discovered a problem with the float valve that was causing water to overflow and flood the surrounding area. Jake waded into the muddy mess without hesitation, and after a moment's pause, Sarah followed him. Together, they managed to fix the valve and reset the system. Standing there ankle-deep in mud and ranch water, Sarah started to laugh. 6 months ago, she would have been horrified at the thought of getting this dirty. Now somehow it felt like an accomplishment. "What's so funny?" Jake asked, though he was smiling too. "Just thinking about how my ex-husband would react if he could see me now," Sarah said. "He always said I was too soft for real work." Jake's expression darkened slightly. "Sounds like your ex-husband was an idiot." It was the first time he'd made any comment about her past, and Sarah felt a warm glow at his casual defense of her capabilities. Maybe Marcus had been wrong about a lot of things. As they drove back toward the ranch house that evening, Sarah watched the sun setting over the pastures and felt something shifting inside her. The work was hard, but it was also honest and straightforward in a way her old life had never been. There were no office politics, no hidden agendas, just the simple satisfaction of solving problems and taking care of living things. Jake seemed to sense her contemplative mood and didn't try to fill the silence with conversation. It wasn't until they were pulling up to the house that he spoke again. "Tomorrow we'll work on the horses," he said, "and I'll teach you how to drive the tractor." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "You trust me with a tractor?" "I trust you to try your best," Jake replied simply. "That's all anyone can ask for." As Sarah headed inside to clean up for dinner, she realized that in just one day, this stranger had shown her more faith in her abilities than her ex-husband had in 5 years of marriage. It was a revelation that left her both grateful and determined to prove that faith wasn't misplaced. The tractor lesson didn't go quite as smoothly as either of them had hoped. Sarah managed to stall the ancient John Deere 3 times before she even got it out of the barn, and her first attempt at driving in a straight line resulted in a zigzag pattern that looked like it had been designed by someone having a seizure. Jake walked alongside, offering gentle corrections and trying not to wince too obviously when she ground the gears. "It's like learning to drive all over again," Sarah said, frustrated with herself as she finally managed to complete a circle around the barnyard without stalling. "Except this time, you're dealing with something that weighs 4 tons and doesn't have power steering," Jake replied. "You're doing fine. My dad put me on this same tractor when I was 12, and I knocked down half a fence post before I got the hang of it." By the end of the week, Sarah had developed a grudging respect for the mechanical monster and could manage most basic operations without Jake having to grab the steering wheel in panic. She'd also learned to muck stalls, properly groom a horse, and identify at least a dozen different types of feed and their purposes. The physical work was transforming her in ways she hadn't expected. Her soft office hands were developing calluses, and her arms and shoulders were getting stronger from hauling feed sacks and hay bales. She'd given up on trying to keep her fingernails clean, and had discovered that her hair looked better in a ponytail after a day of work than it ever had after an hour with a styling iron. More importantly, she was sleeping better than she had in years. The combination of physical exhaustion and clean air knocked her out so completely that she didn't have time to lie awake worrying about her uncertain future or replaying the arguments that had ended her marriage. Jake seemed pleased with her progress, though he wasn't one for excessive praise. His approval came in the form of gradually giving her more responsibility and trusting her to handle tasks on her own. When he asked her to check on the horses while he drove to town for supplies, Sarah felt a surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. The town trip brought back the reality of her situation in the form of a phone call from the auto parts store. Jake returned with the news that her truck parts had finally arrived, but there was a problem. The water pump they'd received was the wrong model, and it would be another week before the correct one could be shipped. "I'm sorry," Sarah said automatically, though she wasn't entirely sure why she was apologizing. "I know you probably need to get back to your regular routine." Jake looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Are you in a hurry to leave?" The question caught her off guard. Was she? A week ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. The ranch had been a temporary refuge, a place to catch her breath before figuring out what came next. But somewhere between learning to handle Buttercup and discovering she could actually fix a broken gate latch, the idea of leaving had become less appealing. "I don't really have anywhere particular to be," she admitted. "Then stay as long as you like," Jake said simply. "You're earning your keep and then some." That evening, they sat on the front porch after dinner, watching the stars appear in a sky clearer than any Sarah had ever seen from the city. Jake had brought out 2 beers and they sat in comfortable silence listening to the night sounds of the ranch settling down for sleep. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said eventually. Jake nodded, taking a sip of his beer. "Why did you help me that first day? Most people would have just given me directions to the nearest gas station." Jake was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd overstepped some boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My dad always said you could tell a lot about a person by how they handled trouble," he said. "You were stranded, probably scared, definitely out of your element, but you didn't fall apart. You got out and started walking toward the only solution you could see. That told me you were worth helping." Sarah felt something warm spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the beer. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "He was. Tough as nails, but fair. He taught me that a ranch is only as good as the people who work it, and that everyone deserves a chance to prove what they're made of." They talked until late that night, sharing stories about their childhoods and the paths that had led them to this porch. Jake told her about growing up on the ranch, about the responsibility he'd felt taking it over after his father's death, and about the loneliness that came with running such a large operation mostly by himself. Sarah found herself opening up about her marriage, about the gradual erosion of her self-confidence as Marcus had criticized her cooking, her career choices, and her inability to give him the children he wanted. She talked about the relief she'd felt when the divorce was finally over, mixed with the terror of starting completely over at 32. "Sounds like you're better off without him," Jake said when she finished. "That's what everyone says, but it doesn't make it less scary." "Being scared doesn't mean you're weak," Jake replied. "It just means you're human. The brave thing is doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." Sarah looked at him in the dim porch light, struck by the quiet wisdom in his words. Marcus had always made her feel like her fears were weaknesses to be overcome or hidden. Jake made them feel like natural responses to be acknowledged and then set aside. The next morning brought an unexpected challenge when Jake announced they needed to move a small herd of cattle from one pasture to another. Sarah had watched this process from a distance but had never participated directly. "It's mostly about staying calm and letting the horses do the work," Jake explained as they saddled up. "Cattle are herd animals, so they want to stay together. Our job is just to give them a gentle push in the right direction." The reality proved more complicated than the explanation. The cattle seemed determined to go in every direction except the one they wanted, and Sarah found herself chasing a particularly stubborn steer who apparently had philosophical objections to being moved. Buttercup, thankfully, knew exactly what she was doing and managed to keep Sarah in the saddle, while maneuvering expertly around the increasingly frustrated cow. By the time they got the herd settled in their new pasture, Sarah was exhausted but exhilarated. There was something primal and satisfying about working with animals and land, about being part of a system that had existed for thousands of years. "Not bad for a city girl," Jake said with a grin as they watched the cattle settle into their new surroundings. "I'm starting to think I might not be as much of a city girl as I thought," Sarah replied. It was a revelation that surprised them both. 2 weeks into her extended stay, Sarah had fallen into a rhythm that felt more natural than any routine she'd ever maintained in the city. She woke before dawn without an alarm, helped Jake with the morning chores, and spent her days learning new aspects of ranch management that fascinated her more than she'd expected. The morning Jake announced they needed to bring in a sick calf for treatment, Sarah didn't hesitate to saddle Buttercup and join him. The calf was in a far pasture, separated from its mother and clearly distressed. Jake approached it with the same calm patience he showed everything else, but the young animal was having none of it. "He's scared and hurting," Jake explained as they watched the calf limp away from them. "Sometimes the kindest thing feels cruel to them at first." It took nearly an hour of careful maneuvering to get close enough to the calf for Jake to rope it gently and lift it onto his horse. Sarah watched in amazement as he handled the frightened animal with such care, talking to it in low, soothing tones while securing it safely for the ride back. At the ranch, Jake set up a makeshift treatment area in one of the smaller corrals. The calf had a deep cut on its front leg, probably from barbed wire, and it was clearly infected. Sarah held the animal steady while Jake cleaned the wound and administered antibiotics. "Will he be okay?" she asked, watching the calf's labored breathing. "Should be fine in a few days," Jake said, stroking the animal's head. "Sometimes they get hurt and hide it until it gets bad. That's why we check on them regular-like." The care and attention Jake showed the injured calf touched something deep in Sarah's heart. She'd grown up thinking that ranching was rough, uncaring work. But watching Jake tend to each animal with genuine concern showed her how wrong that assumption had been. That afternoon, while Jake went into town for more medical supplies, Sarah found herself drawn to check on the recovering calf. The young animal was standing now, nibbling at hay, and looked considerably better than he had that morning. When he allowed her to approach and scratch behind his ears, Sarah felt a surge of connection to this work that went beyond simply earning her keep. She was still sitting with the calf when Jake returned, and something in his expression made her self-conscious about the tender scene he'd walked in on. "He's looking better," Jake observed, though his eyes were on Sarah rather than the animal. "I was just checking on him," Sarah said, suddenly unsure why she felt the need to justify her concern. "That's what makes a good rancher," Jake replied quietly, caring about each individual animal, not just seeing them as numbers or dollar signs. The comment stayed with Sarah through the evening, partly because of what it implied about her natural instincts for this work, but mostly because of the way Jake had looked at her when he said it. There had been something in his expression that made her heart skip in a way she hadn't experienced in years. That night, as they sat on the porch after dinner, the conversation turned to Sarah's plans for the future. The truck would be ready in a few days, and the question of what came next hung between them like a challenge neither was quite ready to address. "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding honest work," Sarah said, staring out at the star-filled sky. "I never realized how much I missed having a purpose until I started working here." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "What kind of purpose did you have before?" Sarah considered the question seriously. "I thought I did with the bookstore. I loved connecting people with books they needed, helping them find stories that would matter to them. But Marcus always said it was just playing around, not real work." "Sounds real to me," Jake said. "Sounds important." The simple validation meant more to Sarah than she could have expressed. Marcus had spent years undermining her confidence in her own judgment, making her doubt the value of work that brought her joy. Jake's matter-of-fact acceptance of her choices felt like a gift. "I've been wondering," Jake continued carefully, "what would happen if you didn't leave right away? What if you stayed on for a while longer?" Sarah's heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this is a big ranch for one person to run alone. I've been thinking about hiring permanent help, someone who could learn the business and maybe eventually become a partner in the operation." He paused, looking directly at her. Someone who cares about the work and the animals, not just the paycheck. The offer hit Sarah like lightning. Partnership in a ranch business was so far from anything she'd ever imagined for herself that she couldn't immediately process it. "Jake, I don't know anything about business management or cattle breeding or any of the technical stuff you do." "Those things can be learned," Jake said. "What can't be taught is whether someone has the heart for this life." "You do." Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't accept charity." Jake's expression grew serious. "This wouldn't be charity. This would be a business partnership with someone I trust. Someone who's already proven she can handle the work and who cares about this place almost as much as I do." The almost in that sentence carried weight that neither of them addressed directly, but Sarah felt it settle around her like a warm blanket. The idea that she might have found not just work but a true home was almost too wonderful to believe. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," Jake replied. "The offer isn't going anywhere." The next few days passed in a strange state of suspended animation. Sarah continued her work routine, but her mind was constantly turning over Jake's proposition. The practical part of her brain cataloged all the reasons it was a crazy idea, while her heart whispered that maybe crazy was exactly what she needed. She found herself paying closer attention to every aspect of the ranch operation, trying to imagine herself as a permanent part of it. Could she really learn to manage breeding programs and market timing? Could she handle the financial pressures and the physical demands year after year? More importantly, what would it mean to build a life so closely intertwined with Jake's? The question became more complicated when she caught Jake watching her work, with an expression that went beyond professional interest. There were moments when their eyes met across a corral, or when he handed her a tool and their fingers brushed, that the air between them seemed charged with possibility. Sarah hadn't planned on romance being part of her fresh start. She'd assumed she needed time to heal from her divorce before even thinking about another relationship, but there was something about Jake's steady presence, his quiet confidence, and his genuine respect for her capabilities that made her feel ready for things she hadn't thought she wanted. The tension came to a head when they were working together to repair a gate that had been damaged by a bull with territorial issues. Sarah was holding a post steady while Jake attached new hinges, and they were working so closely together that she could feel the warmth of his body and catch the scent of his soap mixed with honest sweat. When Jake looked up and found her watching him, something shifted in the air between them. For a moment, neither of them moved, and Sarah felt the world narrow down to just the two of them and the possibility hanging in the space between his lips and hers. Then a crash from the nearby corral broke the spell as the bull in question decided to voice his opinion about their repair work. They sprang apart, both laughing nervously, but the moment lingered between them like a promise of things that might be possible if they were brave enough to reach for them. The storm hit on a Tuesday night with the kind of sudden violence that turns the Texas sky black and fills the air with electricity. Sarah woke to the sound of rain hammering against her bedroom window, and the low rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the entire house. Through her window, she could see lightning illuminating the pastures in stark, brief moments that made the familiar landscape look alien and threatening. Jake was already up, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and a weather radio crackling with updates. His expression was grim as he listened to reports of high winds and hail moving through the area. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked, pulling on her boots and rain jacket. "Bad enough," Jake replied. "We need to get the horses into the barn and check that the cattle in the south pasture have access to shelter. This kind of storm can spook them into doing something stupid." They worked through the early morning hours, moving animals to safety and securing anything that might become a projectile in the high winds. Sarah was soaked to the skin within minutes, but she found herself exhilarated by the raw power of the storm and the urgent necessity of their work. The horses were nervous, prancing and nickering as Jake and Sarah led them into the safety of the barn. Buttercup pressed close to Sarah, seeking comfort from the human she'd learned to trust. Sarah stroked the mare's neck and murmured reassurances, surprised by how naturally the caretaking role came to her. By the time they'd secured all the animals, both Sarah and Jake were exhausted and drenched. They stood in the barn doorway, watching the storm rage outside, and Sarah felt a deep satisfaction at having successfully protected the creatures under their care. "You did good out there," Jake said, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "Most people would have stayed inside." "These animals depend on us," Sarah replied simply. "How could I stay inside?" Jake turned to look at her, and in the intermittent lightning flashes, Sarah saw something in his expression that made her breath catch. There was admiration there, but also something deeper and more personal. "Sarah," he began, then stopped as a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the building. They waited out the worst of the storm in the barn, sitting on hay bales and listening to the wind howl around them. Jake told her stories about other storms he'd weathered, about the time his father had insisted on checking the cattle during a tornado warning, and how they'd huddled in a drainage ditch while the funnel cloud passed overhead. "Sounds terrifying," Sarah said. "It was. But it was also the moment I realized this land was worth risking everything for," Jake replied. My dad could have built a successful business anywhere, but this place was in his blood. It's in mine too. Sarah understood what he meant. In just a few weeks, she'd felt herself becoming connected to this land in ways she'd never experienced. The thought of leaving it now felt like tearing away part of herself. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find significant damage. Several sections of fence were down. The roof of one of the storage sheds had been partially torn off and debris was scattered everywhere. It would take days of work to set everything right. But they'd also discovered something unexpected. During their storm preparations, Sarah and Jake had worked together with an efficiency and trust that felt like they'd been partners for years rather than weeks. They'd anticipated each other's needs, communicated without words, and handled the crisis with a teamwork that surprised them both. I couldn't have managed that alone, Jake admitted as they surveyed the damage in the morning light. You wouldn't have had to manage it alone? Sarah replied. That's what partners do, right? Handle the tough times together. The word partners hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went beyond business arrangements. Jake studied her face for a long moment as if trying to read something there. Is that what we are? He asked quietly. Partners? Sarah felt her heart racing, but she met his gaze steadily. I'd like to be. The kiss that followed was gentle and inevitable, like the sunrise after a long night. Sarah had forgotten what it felt like to be kissed by someone who truly saw her, who valued her strength rather than trying to diminish it. When they finally broke apart, she felt like she was seeing the world in color for the first time in years. I have something to tell you, Jake said, his hands still framing her face. Your truck's been ready for 3 days. Sarah stared at him in shock. What? The parts came in Friday and I had Pete install them over the weekend. I've been trying to work up the courage to tell you. Afraid you'd leave if you knew you could. Instead of anger, Sarah felt a rush of tenderness for this man who'd been brave enough to fight a storm, but was afraid to admit he wanted her to stay. Why didn't you just ask me not to go? Because I wanted it to be your choice, Jake said. I wanted you to stay because you wanted to be here, not because you felt trapped or obligated. Sarah thought about the woman who'd broken down on this highway weeks ago, desperate and directionless. That woman felt like a stranger now. In her place stood someone who knew the satisfaction of honest work, who'd found her place in a community of two, who'd discovered strength she never knew she possessed. I choose to stay, she said simply. The weeks following the storm brought a new rhythm to their days, one that acknowledged the shift in their relationship without overwhelming the practical demands of ranch life. Sarah found herself moving through tasks with a confidence that would have amazed her former self, making decisions about cattle management and equipment maintenance that Jake trusted without question. The partnership papers they drew up were straightforward business documents, but the conversation that preceded them was anything but simple. They spent hours discussing everything from profit sharing to long-term goals, discovering that their visions for the ranch's future aligned in ways that went beyond mere compatibility. I've been thinking about diversifying, Jake said one evening as they reviewed breeding records in his office. Maybe adding some sheep, or starting a small organic vegetable operation. This land could support more than just cattle. Sarah looked up from the ledger she'd been studying. I've been thinking about that too. What if we also considered agritourism? People pay good money to experience authentic ranch life, and we could offer that without compromising the working operation. Jake's eyes lit up with interest. You mean like dude ranch activities? Not exactly. More like educational experiences. Teach people about sustainable ranching. Let them participate in real work. Show them where their food comes from. There's a market for authentic experiences, especially among families who want their kids to understand rural life. The idea energized them both, and they spent the next several days walking the property with fresh eyes, imagining how they might accommodate visitors while maintaining the integrity of their operation. Sarah's background in retail and customer service proved invaluable as they discussed the practical aspects of hosting guests. The planning sessions revealed new layers to their partnership that surprised them both. Where Jake saw problems, Sarah often saw opportunities. Where Sarah worried about logistics, Jake provided practical solutions born from years of experience. Their different perspectives strengthened their decision-making in ways that neither had anticipated, but it was the quiet moments that truly defined their evolving relationship. The morning Sarah found Jake in the barn before dawn, sitting with a sick mare and singing softly to calm her. The evening he discovered Sarah reading ranch management books by lamplight, taking notes in careful handwriting. The day they successfully delivered their first calf together, working in perfect synchronization to help a struggling heifer bring new life into the world. Sarah's divorce had taught her to be wary of depending on another person, but what she was building with Jake felt fundamentally different. Marcus had wanted her to be smaller, quieter, more compliant. Jake challenged her to be stronger, smarter, more capable. The difference was transformative. The test of their new partnership came when Jake's neighbor, Ed Morrison, stopped by with what he called a friendly warning. Morrison was a traditional rancher who'd been skeptical of Jake's modern methods and was even more dubious about his partnership with a woman who'd appeared out of nowhere. "You sure you know what you're doing, Jake?" Morrison asked, glancing pointedly at Sarah as she worked nearby. "Running a ranch isn't like playing house. When the bank comes calling, you need someone who can handle the pressure." Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Jake stepped forward with a calm that somehow made his words more forceful than shouting would have. "Ed, Sarah's been handling pressure just fine. In fact, she's improved our efficiency by about 20% in the past month alone. I'd say that's someone who knows exactly what she's doing." Morrison's skepticism was evident, but he couldn't argue with results. The ranch was clearly thriving under their joint management, and word was getting around about innovative practices that other operations were starting to adopt. After Morrison left, Sarah found herself struggling with doubts she thought she'd conquered. What if the neighbor was right? What if she was in over her head? What if her inexperience ended up costing Jake everything he'd worked for? Jake found her that evening sitting by the water tank where they'd first worked together, staring out at the sunset with troubled eyes. "Morrison got to you," he said, settling beside her on the grass. "What if he's right?" Sarah asked. "What if I'm not cut out for this? You've worked your whole life to build this place, and I've been here less than 2 months. Jake was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. "You know what I see when I look at this ranch now?" he said finally. "I see a place that's alive in ways it hasn't been since my dad died. I see someone who cares about every animal, every blade of grass, every detail that makes this operation work. I see a partner who makes me better at my own job." He turned to face her directly. "Morrison's been running his ranch the same way for 30 years, and it shows. His land is overgrazed, his cattle are mediocre, and he's 1 bad year away from bankruptcy. You've been here 8 weeks, and you're already thinking about innovations that could secure our future for generations." Sarah felt the knot in her chest loosening as Jake continued. "Besides," he added with a slight smile, "if you were just playing house, you probably would have given up the first time you had to pull a calf or muck out a stall in 90-degree heat." That made her laugh despite her worries. "I definitely didn't picture myself elbow-deep in birthing fluids when I was imagining my future. But you did it anyway," Jake pointed out. "And you did it well. That's not someone who's just playing around." The conversation shifted to practical matters as they discussed upcoming decisions about breeding schedules and equipment purchases. Sarah found herself contributing ideas and insights that Jake not only welcomed, but actively sought out. By the time they headed back to the house, her confidence had returned, stronger than before because it was now based on proven performance rather than hopeful assumptions. That night, as they sat on the porch reviewing the day's accomplishments, Jake brought up something that had been on both their minds. "There's something we need to discuss," he said carefully, "about what people in town are probably saying about us living together." Sarah had been aware of the potential for gossip, but the reality of their situation had evolved so naturally that she hadn't given it much thought. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Jake said, his voice steady but his hands betraying nervousness as he fidgeted with his coffee cup, "that maybe we should make this official. The partnership, I mean. And maybe more than just the business partnership." Sarah's heart started racing, but she kept her voice calm. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" Jake set down his cup and turned to face her fully. "I'm asking if you'd consider marrying me. Not because of what people might say, but because I can't imagine running this place without you anymore. Because somewhere between teaching you to handle cattle and watching you care for sick animals, I fell in love with the strongest, most capable woman I've ever met." The proposal was so perfectly Jake, practical and heartfelt at the same time, that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. This wasn't the grand romantic gesture Marcus had staged, complete with expensive ring and public declaration. This was something infinitely more valuable, a recognition of partnership, respect, and genuine love built on shared work and mutual admiration. Sarah's answer came not in words, but in the way she reached for Jake's hands, intertwining their fingers that were equally calloused from shared work. "Yes," she said simply, and the single word carried the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. They were married 3 months later, in a ceremony that perfectly reflected their partnership. The wedding took place on the ranch itself, with the pastor standing under the old oak tree where Jake's grandparents had been married 60 years earlier. Sarah wore her grandmother's simple white dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers picked from their own pastures. Jake wore his best suit, the one he'd inherited from his father, with boots polished to a shine that wouldn't last past the first dance. The guest list was small but meaningful. Jake's family came from 3 states away, and Sarah's sister flew in from California, amazed at the transformation she saw in her formerly city-bound sibling. The neighbors who'd been skeptical of their partnership found themselves impressed by the obvious happiness and mutual respect the couple shared. Ed Morrison even showed up, bringing a wedding gift and an apology that was probably as close to admitting he'd been wrong as anyone was likely to get from him. "You two seem to have figured something out," he told them during the reception. "Ranch looks better than it has in years." But it was the moment when Jake whispered his vows to Sarah that truly sealed their commitment to each other and to the life they were building together. "I promise to work beside you through drought and plenty, through seasons of plenty and seasons of struggle. I promise to respect your strength and share my weaknesses. And I promise that whatever we build together will always be better than anything either of us could have built alone." Sarah's vows were equally heartfelt and practical. "I promise to choose this life with you every day, through the work that will challenge us and the love that will sustain us. I promise to see this land through your eyes and help you see it through mine. And I promise that the woman who was lost on that highway will spend the rest of her life proving worthy of the man who helped her find her way home." The first year of their marriage brought challenges that tested their partnership in ways courtship never could. A late spring frost damaged their hay crop, forcing them to buy expensive feed to get their cattle through the summer. A drought in late summer stressed their pastures and required careful management of their water resources. Sarah's first attempt at managing the books revealed inefficiencies in their operation that required difficult decisions about equipment purchases and staffing. But each challenge they faced together only strengthened their bond and their confidence in their partnership. When the hay crop failed, Sarah's research into alternative feed sources saved them thousands of dollars. When the drought hit, Jake's generational knowledge of the land combined with Sarah's fresh perspective led to water management, innovations that their neighbors soon copied. The agritourism program Sarah had envisioned became a reality the following spring, starting small with weekend workshops on sustainable ranching practices. Their first group of visitors included a retired teacher, a young family from Dallas, and a college student writing a thesis on rural economics. Sarah's natural teaching ability and Jake's deep knowledge created an experience that had guests booking return visits before they'd even finished their stay. "You were right about people wanting authentic experiences," Jake told Sarah as they watched their first group of visitors help with the morning feeding routine. "Look at that kid with the cattle. You'd think he'd never seen anything so fascinating." Sarah smiled, watching a 10-year-old from the city follow Jake around with the devoted attention of someone discovering a whole new world. "It's not just about the experience," she said. "It's about the connection. These people live so far removed from where their food comes from the rhythms of the land. When they get a taste of this life, it changes something in them." The educational component of their operation grew naturally from those early workshops. Sarah developed curricula for school groups, teaching children about responsible land management and animal husbandry. Jake's patient explanations of breeding programs and rotational grazing captured the attention of agricultural students and seasoned ranchers alike. By their second anniversary, they were running a diversified operation that had attracted attention from agricultural journals and sustainable farming organizations. The ranch was more profitable than it had ever been under Jake's sole management, but more importantly, it had become a model for how modern ranching could balance productivity with environmental stewardship. The success brought offers that would have seemed impossible to refuse. A large agricultural corporation wanted to buy their operation outright for a sum that would have made them wealthy by any measure. A university offered Jake a position developing their sustainable agriculture program, with Sarah invited to head their extension education efforts. They considered both opportunities seriously, discussing the advantages and weighing them against what they'd built together. In the end, the decision was easy. "This land is part of us now," Sarah said as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint their pastures gold. "We could make more money somewhere else, probably have an easier life. But this is home. This is where we belong." Jake nodded, understanding completely. "My dad always said the land chooses its people as much as people choose the land. This place chose you just like it chose me." As the seasons turned and their partnership deepened, Sarah often thought about the woman who'd broken down on that dusty highway 3 years earlier. That woman had been running away from a failed life, desperate and directionless. She could never have imagined the strength she'd discover in herself, or the love she'd find with a man who saw her potential before she saw it herself. The ranch had taught her that honest work done with care and commitment could be its own reward. Jake had shown her that partnership meant building each other up, rather than tearing each other down. Together, they'd created something that was greater than the sum of its parts, a life that satisfied them both and served purposes larger than themselves. On quiet evenings when the work was done and they sat together planning for the future, Jake would sometimes return to the words he'd spoken that first day, when he'd offered her work in exchange for room and board. "I'd offer twice that if you never left," he'd murmur, and Sarah would smile, knowing that he'd gotten so much more than he'd bargained for, and so had she. The woman who'd thought she was lost had actually been exactly where she needed to be, heading toward a future she couldn't have imagined, but was exactly what she'd been searching for all along. Sometimes the best thing that could happen to a person was getting stranded in the middle of nowhere, close enough to somewhere that felt like home.